Over to you, Bryan.
Great, thank you, Pierre. And thank you all for joining us here this afternoon. We have a terrific panel, and I think Commissioner Rosenworcel did a great job of both identifying some successes and failures, identifying a few things we can learn from, but also starting to put sort of the intellectual flesh on the bones, if you will, of how to think about successes and failures. And this panel is supposed to be a continuation of that discussion, namely what defines a success or a failure. What vectors matter the most? Is it economic? Is it scientific? What are the things is it about the decision being a good or bad one at the time it is made or in retrospect? And how do all these different things fit together? So we have a terrific panel to discuss that. We have Julie Knapp from the FCC, who's taught us all more about spectrum management than we can ever thank him enough for, and we appreciate that. Tom Hazlett, who's recently come out with a groundbreaking book on spectrum management that is a terrific read for those of you who have not had a chance to buy it yet. I've bought it for many people and around town. Peter is also joining us, bringing the economic perspective, financial perspective to our debate, and then Michele Farquhar from Hogan Lovells, former wireless bureau chief at the FCC, who brings both the private sector and the public sector perspective as well. So I want to start with the fundamental question, which is how should policymakers define whether a spectrum policy is a success or a failure? And as I previewed in our pre-conference conversations, just take 2 or 3 minutes to kind of walk through how you think about that problem, and we'll start with you, Julie.
So maybe a little different answer than you'd expect, because I think that there's a temptation when you look back on spectrum decisions and you look at the marketplace and you say, well, this thing took off or that didn't take off. And I don't think that's really the appropriate way to think about, well, what was successful or not. At least to me, a success, I know for folks that worked in the government or at the FCC or in Congress, you feel successful when you finally got something across the line. That I think it's about creating opportunities. And not having the government decide whether your idea is going to be successful or not. So one measure of success, at least in the way I think about it, is have we created a fair opportunity for providing access for spectrum, whether that is licensed or unlicensed, flexible use, and so forth. And there's lots of different models that we've applied through the years, but I've always looked at it as that's our job, is we've got to make sure that people have a chance to get out there, let the market decide. Secondly, the old do no harm rule. If you engage or have been engaged in commission proceedings, you know that there's a lot of back and forth, often discussion about disastrous consequences if we take an action. Incumbent services are going to collapse and so forth. I would venture that instances where there's been any harms have been rare. Now, we have an obligation to make sure that the incumbent services, and I think this is on both sides of the house, whether it's federal, non-federal, and so forth, are protected. There's a lot of debate about what constitutes protection, but overall I think things, we've done a pretty good job in making sure that there aren't harms. Some might criticize sometimes is that we've been too conservative and that a service might have been more successful if we allowed 10 watts instead of 4. So that's something you always weigh, in the trade-offs. Just a few more points. Sometimes I think the policy decisions, and I don't mean to be critical of any one particular thing, drive us to, for example, going back to the mid-90s, identify 225 megahertz to transfer from federal use to non-federal use. And some of it wound up being terrific, and some of it wound up being what we called cats and dogs. 5 here, 15 there, and so forth. And I think it kind of plays into how we set things up when we, at times, and I don't think it's a problem just with numbers, because that can be a good driver, but looking at the value that we're able to create with spectrum rather than just a number. Can you really do something with 5 megahertz that's going to promote investment? And I think specifically, for example, is this band at 1670 to 1675, which we ended up auctioning. And people tried to deploy a service in the market. It was not successful from a business standpoint. And we're still wrestling today with what to do with it. So I think being mindful of not just the numbers, but what is the value. And while I'm at it, just one other point. The 100 megahertz, for example, that the federal government came up with at 3550 to 3650 to add on to 50 we had already. So when we started out, it was lemons. It was exclusion zones, and folks were like, thanks, but what are we going to do with this? Fortunately there, we were able to make lemonade. But it's an example of where sometimes you're hitting a number. I gave you 100 megahertz, but with all the strings that are attached, can you really do something with it? And we did work that through, I think, successfully working with the federal government and the industry to completely turn that around into something positive. Last point. The old maxim, you can find a lot of failures on the road to success. And so you might look at any individual decision and think, well, gee, that didn't really go anywhere. But when you start to look at the trail of where it led to, it often were the lessons learned that came out of it that led to something successful. I'd leave you with, Edison didn't get the light bulb on the first try. We didn't get to the moon without some bumps in the road. And so I think the worst thing that we can do on the spectrum side is not try to tackle the hard problems.
So just to one follow-up, Commissioner Rosenworcel touched on this, but at what point is it appropriate to say something didn't work and move on?
And here, yeah, that's a great question. I was going to save it for later. But here is, it is tough trying to figure out, well, at what point do you say it didn't work? And let me give you a couple of examples. DBS, allocation 1981, 1982, 12 gigahertz band.
Explain what it is.
Direct broadcasting satellite. The idea was we're going to transmit TV signals from space, and some might remember people with 3-meter dishes on their front lawns or yards. And I still remember a lot of folks, later 80s, what a terrible decision that was. Nobody's using it, it's not going anywhere. So what changed? The technology changed. Suddenly, we could do higher power satellites, which meant we could use smaller dishes. And when we got to the 90s, it took off. So you're always asking yourself. I come back to the provisions for spread spectrum in 1985. And there's a whole trail of history on the unlicensed rules. But obviously a lot of this I lived it. First 5 years, hardly anything happened. And into the early 90s, it was all about frequency hopping technology. There were other things that happened along the way. The uni rules came along, which said you can use any kind of digital technology. Different band, this 5 gigahertz, we opened up some additional spectrum. We said, just do digital. So it was the first generation of Wi-Fi, the B standard, that actually used a true spread spectrum technique. And after that first generation, folks came back and said, can't we use any digital? And all the succeeding generations were based on OFDM. So the explosion, it might have happened anyway, but there were things that happened along the way that got us there. And so it all comes back to your question, how long do you wait? And that's two other maxims. If you ever want to know whether spectrum is being used, just propose to reallocate it. Suddenly you'll have folks coming out of the woodwork, you had no idea. We're there. And second maxim, if you're sitting on spectrum that is not being used heavily, you can rest assured somebody else is looking for it. You know. Thanks.
All
Sorry.
right, Tom, same question. How do you define whether it's a success or a failure?
Well, apparently I'm having trouble with this because I listened to Pierre about the Survey Monkey that I took. I believe I took the same survey, and I thought it said awesome to amazing. Excuse me, awful to amazing, not awesome. Was it awesome? I thought it said amazing. That was my go-to answer. It says TV white spaces. That was amazing. Amazing they didn't listen to me. So whoever the survey, if they really have a monkey and they're interpreting my results, I'd like to actually get the printout because it would explain it to me and everybody else. Okay. So yeah, no, this is a very easy question to me because I keep reading Ronald Coase's 1959 article where he explains this. It's not, we don't want to minimize interference. We want to maximize welfare. We want to maximize the sum total of the gains, the net gains. And, you know, there'll be a lot of interference in that kind of a world, hopefully. Zero interference, obviously not optimal. So you want the most activity. And when you look at the process, how spectrum allocation works, one of the things that jumps out is that there's a lot of focus on the next idea, the application that's on this margin. But the next margin, the one that's just around the corner, and of course there's always one around the corner in this space, how do you even know what the next margin is? Because the next corner is coming and so much dynamic change. And you want, obviously, some kind of a process that can deliver that flexibility. And of course, we have had so much experience with rigidities and spending years to do stuff that's obsolete. And we just had a talk about this in 5.9. We had rigidity put in 1999 about how this would happen, how much spectrum would be utilized, what the application was, what the rules were. And, you know, we're inching towards Bethlehem, and the whole world has moved. And so now what do we do here? 1962. TV's a no-brainer. Of course we need TV for education. Let's have educational institutions. Get television rights. What could be wrong with that idea? And, you know, it leads to a lot of, I remember being at the FCC some years ago, when I got on friendly terms with a Catholic priest. Who was very interested in that television, allocation.
The biggest holders of the educational broadband service is the Catholic Church.
For higher purposes than mere terrestrial wireless.
I got up to the bishop.
You got the bishop. So these things take on a life of their own. This is what happens in any regulatory process, any business process, as it winds its way through the market, through technological stops and consumer valuations and so forth, competition in the marketplace. You want to put into place a process that is flexible and can discover from moment to moment and generation to generation what the optimum is. And to look at the world and say, that's a great idea, let's do that, and not pay attention to the process by which it can be fixed. And it will have to be fixed. That's what we know. We've learned that. But we haven't really learned about how to put the flexibility in. And it's not just to open it up and throw caution to the wind. It's to strategically put rights in the marketplace that allow for the revaluations and the discoveries and, of course, the experiments that reveal all that new information, and then allow the deployments to take place that allow bargaining to facilitate gains from trade so that you don't have the rigidities that keep us with 75 megahertz that seemed like a good idea at the time, but where the world has moved on. By the way, I do have a paper that I gave at some meetings in March. I should do more with that paper where I said to go ahead and give General Motors and BMW the 75 megahertz. Then you'd find out very quickly how outmoded DSRC is for the autonomous vehicles. If you had actual responsible enterprises in the marketplace who had the ability to reallocate it, and as I also know from Coast, it wouldn't make difference which those parties were as long as they had that ability. So one of the great failures in the marketplace that I think was a huge success was the liberal allocation. There was all kinds of other problems, but to the extent that some licenses to reuse TV spectrum got out in the early 2000s and were auctioned off 2002, 3, 4, and you had some ability to experiment with channel 55, UHF TV channel 55, and you had a company like Qualcomm say, here's a good thing to do with $1 billion. It's called media flow. And they got some of these licenses and made some deals with TV stations that were adjacent and so forth and so on. The marketplace was allowed to work on that. Media flow was a huge success with 7 or 8 people. And Qualcomm, by 2010 is looking at the situation and decides to go ahead and reallocate the spectrum. Now, it's very interesting. With those flexible rights, they're able to do that. They're not reallocating the actual use in terms of mobile TV to mobile TV. It goes to AT&T that does mobile TV and needs more spectrum to do mobile TV, but it's a different way of doing it, wrapped into a different network environment, different technology. All that gets to take place with flexibility assigned to the rights that were now in the market and the subject for gains from trade. And so you get this kind of very nice allocation. So last summer there was a 5G notice was put out by the FCC, and I noticed how remarkable it was, how terrific and how terrible the same notice could be. And I thought the disappointing parts were standard FCC boilerplate. Please, the FCC is very interested to have all the parties reveal exactly what the technologies are, the service models, and what the future businesses will be in this 5G space. Okay, now, with all due respect to every lawyer in the audience, that's a bad program for society. Okay, I understand this is bread and butter. You can keep that argument going on for decades. The great part of that allocation, where it says it asks about certain rights and how certain rights can be reallocated to the market with flexibility. That's where the discussion should be. How can we set up a platform on which the new discoveries take place in cooperation amongst all the players that might have incentives to cooperate and the ability to use capital markets, technology, and laboratory experiments, and experiments with customers, actual people buying services, how all that ecosystem is facilitated. And questions about the most efficient way to do that are exactly what regulators should focus on. And so, we've made strides. Commissioner Rosenworcel very eloquently summed up many of the strides the United States has taken on that. I think we know a lot about where that world should be, and I think we should focus on that and not just on the very next margin, what we can see, what is visible for the moment.
Okay, so a couple of things. One is for the students in the audience in particular, one of the great things about spectrum management is its interdisciplinary nature. So we've heard from an engineering perspective, the middle 2 panelists are about the economics, and Michele and I are unfortunately the bookends on the law. But Tom, you talked about maximizing consumer welfare as sort of your lodestar, if you will. How does that translate into Defense Department operations or radio astronomy or other things that don't lend themselves to that kind of traditional consumer welfare assessment? Right.
So, and just to correct myself, when you are thinking about welfare maximization, it's not the situation that you want to download the actual welfare calculations to government agents, because it's, again, that's an open-ended road to nowhere. What you want is some understanding of where efficiencies lie and how they can be facilitated by rules that really assist cooperation. Now, when you come into that with certain constraints, including, say, Department of Defense, you do have to be creative, and you have certain objectives. One is to put a price on things, not just have other government agencies talk about what the DoD defense costs are, because the DoD can certainly calculate their benefits, but you want other agencies to really, from a unique or different perspective, to try to put opportunity costs on. In fact, I was just thinking about this the other day. How interesting would it be if we went to all government agencies and said, what spectrum can you do without?
Wouldn't be very interesting at all. Right?
Wouldn't be interesting. No, we know that. In fact, that's why we have the Department of Commerce involved in this. That's why we have other institutions, OMB, for example. That's why we actually look within the public sector for different perspectives, because self-interest is a gravity, and it's extremely useful. You know, economists should be aware of that fact, and I don't want to be mistaken. We love the self-interest of the, in fact, I'm not at all being facetious. I want the Department of Defense executives to take their mission seriously and not to give quarter. But I want other agencies to, and private sector institutions to do their part to point out what the costs to society are. And we want to open up, to the greatest extent possible, the analysis, discussion, and as to cite Commissioner Rosenworcel, even bring in private enterprises with hunting licenses or some other mechanism to actually get rights or secondary rights to access DoD and other spectrum, because these self-interested positions will force a different perspective, a different discussion, and a different result in terms of how we can really rationalize the use of these frequencies, which is very difficult. This is why you're giving me the question saying DoD. We want the DoD to do its job, and yet we want them to do it efficiently. And so that comes from this diversity of access to the information and to the discussion and ultimately to the resources, to the access to the spectrum by, say, private bidders that have opportunities that they can exploit that the DoD can't, and yet there can be perhaps a meeting of the minds, gains from trade, that is so common in private sectors with good established legal institutions, but is very difficult when you don't have the property rights and the legal institutions in the public sector.
Peter, how should policymakers define a success or a failure from your perspective?
Well, I'm learning a lot here today. I remember when I was a kid, growing up as a good Catholic boy, I had to watch Bishop Sheen. I didn't realize he had a piece of the action. So that
I was educated.
That was news to me. I go back to wireless auctions, to I think the very first ones, when A and B were awarded, and I participated in the D&E auctions and was trying to start a company. And I think the C block were a few of the nationwide providers, if I remember. It goes back to 20-something years ago. That's a long time ago. But then my opinion, I think, was pretty much the same as it is today, that successful auctions are the ones that sponsor innovation. Because you cannot track or guess what the technology will do with that spectrum. I've been on some boards where using unlicensed spectrum, and I'm just amazed in terms of how technology drives the use of spectrums that were not considered to be necessarily viable. When I started this business, people talked about the spectrum that was in the A and B licenses as having been broad enough. It was at 900 megahertz. We were bidding on some unknown stuff at the 1.8 because it had no penetration. So what was interesting to me is the people that owned the lower bands were pretty convinced that they had stymied every other competitor in there. And that's the way they viewed it. So I viewed spectrum as, if it can sponsor innovation, and I think narrow bands, whether using guard bands or maximizing the efficiency of that, is what drives innovation. Technology stays a step or two steps ahead of what people are thinking. And there's hundreds of examples throughout history of people thinking that their old technology is going to win. Conversely, my definition of a spectrum that is poorly allocated, I'll use that phrase, poorly allocated, is one which benefits just a few, or either advantages or disadvantages other players. So that's my perspective on what would make success, what drives success.
So you use the term sponsor innovation. So to what degree should the government put a finger on that in promoting innovation? So I remember 1670 to 75, we had people come in and said, I remember.
It was Marty.
Yes, it was Marty Cooper in a Raycom, but there were a number of people came in and they said they had this innovative, there was a dog tracking one too, that they were going to track everyone's pet on 1670 to 75.
That's IoT.
Yeah, nowadays. But anyway, so to what point do you say, okay, there's an innovative use coming, we should set it aside for innovators, and maybe keep out incumbents, or we hear that IoT is going to be a big thing. So to what point, where does government put in its thumb, if at all, on the sponsoring innovation piece?
I'm kind of in favor of not putting your thumb in. I think it's hard to figure it out. I'll tell you a little crazy story that's true. When we were looking at bidding in those original auctions, we had already, and my background, I'd come out of a company that had just developed the first network for the BlackBerry before I came here to build the wireless company, the cell phone business. And so I was kind of intrigued with this whole notion of sending email and doing some of those kinds of things wirelessly, which were not very popular or even well known at that time. But I sent my staff home for the weekend, and I said, your job is to come back on Monday and come up with a couple of ways in which people will use cell phones without talking. I was just unheard of. I had, a number of people had some cell phone businesses, and we had been in the analog business and so forth. And so, but they came back with some very interesting notions, like just the way the cellular networks worked then. It's like you could listen to a college football game from your hometown back in New York, in Denver. It was very easy to make that happen, and being able to do that. So innovation comes from, everywhere. Some people say necessity is the mother of invention. I used to like to say lack of money is the mother of invention in trying to get these things done. But I think if you try to put your finger on that, you're going to miss it a lot.
At least when it's the government. I hear you say.
The government, yes.
Michele?
So you already referred to my role as a lawyer, so I'll actually start with the Communications Act in Section 1.
Michele.
There we go.
I'm going to argue with you now.
Okay.
This is my expertise.
Okay. So it says that the role of the FCC, the core mission, is to make available so far as possible to all people of the U.S. rapid, efficient, nationwide, and worldwide wire and radio communication services with adequate facilities at reasonable charges. And that's not a bad measure or metric for success when you think about it, because the speed and extent of deployment, the scope of deployment, the number of participants is certainly a valid way, and including in rural areas, and the cost of the service, if it's a consumer-oriented service, is a good way to measure success. Certainly not the only measure, because there are different types of services that are needed, and the more different types, the more innovative types, probably the better. But it's one way to look at it, and probably an easy measure for the easy things. So certainly we can define it that way sometimes. The problem is some things are outside of the FCC's control, and things come up such as other parts of the world do things either through JPP or through work, or the equipment problems emerge, and as these issues get more complicated, there are fewer things within the U.S. policymakers' control, and they have to keep these other variables into account. And also, it's just not a static world on the spectrum side. And things that seem like great ideas 30 years ago then have had to be changed many times over. And so you can't look at it the static way. And I thought both Tom and Julie mentioned some good ways of looking at this problem, especially in terms of building flexibility into the system, and how you do that effectively, not just in terms of the substance and saying flexible use, which became a mantra under Reed Hunt's administration, but also in terms of a flexible process. And that's something that Tom hit on that I think is really a wise way to look at it, because if the process isn't flexible, then you're going to have a waiver by waiver, step-by-step approach, which might be longer and difficult. So you kind of have to build into the system. Now, some countries have actually done it that you don't get any renewal expectancy, which is a tough road to hoe. But then the government sorts out at the end of the day, okay, and sometimes they do. They take licenses back. Then they replow the garden and say, no, we like it better this way. And then you might get an opportunity for that same spectrum back again. That's not how the U.S. has done it, but that's another system.
So just, you touted flexibility there, and you're a veteran of both leadership roles, both at NTIA and the FCC. And how does flexibility play a role in spectrum management at NTIA, or how should it? And sort of turning back to the conversation we had with Tom about DoD and radio astronomy, what have you, a lot of federal government uses where flexibility gets tricky.
It does get tricky because of the cost of the system, and it's just harder. It's not a private marketplace. It's easier in the private market. That is not a private market. And there are a lot of economic issues that go into that and how they use their spectrum. Now, they've done a good job over the years of being pushed to consolidate more and to get revenues from spectrum auctions so they can move and relocate. But that's a long process. But it's worked, and it's been effective. But I think certainly NTIA over the years has become much more sensitive to the fact that there needs to be more squeezing and compression of spectrum to make more spectrum available for other technologies and uses. But it's a hard process.
So at various times, people have talked about success in terms of, or failures, in terms of time to market. We've touched on a few of those. Economic impact, a few of those. Scientific value, brought a few of those out. Efficient use, you could define success by how efficiently the spectrum is used at any given time. Contribution to innovation. Michele touched on a couple other ones that are statutory, universal service or serving underserved, price. Is the answer that we, the policymakers, should look at all those things at once? Or would it be appropriate for policymakers to say, I'm really worried about underserved, so I'm going to auction, or I'm going to distribute the spectrum to anybody who will say they're going to serve all the underserved, or I'm going to have this spectrum be set aside for a low-cost service, or I'm going to have this spectrum set aside because it's going to have the maximum economic benefit. So is it all just one big mush, or how do you think about those factors or others in defining success? I don't know, Michele, do you want to start?
I think you can't do it all in any one spectrum proceeding, because you might find that you are hitting the mark with respect to some of those goals already in one type of service. Let's say core cellular or wireless service has done a pretty good job there, but there were some holes and gaps. And so the FCC had to go back and look at that and re-examine where are the holes that need to be filled in. And if it can't be filled in that particular spectrum proceeding or in that band, maybe look at other bands. And the FCC has actually allocated certain bands. There was the Better service at one point that was kind of a rural deployed service that probably is not something that's viewed as efficient or effective today. But at the time it was introduced, it was viewed as quite efficient or effective. So I think that is also something that's going to change. And looking at ways to balance the needs and some of those different goals, I think will be important over time.
Anybody else want to jump in on that?
It just seems to me that you talked about three things there, all of which may or may not have national policy interests, right? So you can't to say this spectrum is going to be for underserved is good if we decide that we want to underserved or serve the underserved. All of those things are viable reasons, but it starts with a policy at a national level about what we're trying to achieve as a society and for what purpose. So, I have no objection to any of that. I think probably the most efficient and maybe least likely to achieve those goals is if you just leave it in the hands of people or businesses who are going to always make it more efficient and drive it towards their own economic benefit, which may or may not line up with those.
Right. Is unoccupied spectrum always a failure, Tom?
Oh, of course not. I mean, any more than unoccupied real estate. I mean, sometimes it's efficient to develop, and sometimes it's efficient to wait. You have option value. And I'm leaving aside the part. You say, well, you don't want Yellowstone developed, and you might want to leave some spectrum that's unoccupied in a certain sense, but is useful for other amenities. But No, there's a rational pattern, and so this is why you want incentives in the marketplace that discover when to develop and how much to develop it. Because as you get as instantly as you get when you get into these questions about, for example, build-out requirement. What is the build-out requirement? I just heard a great story this morning. I won't repeat, but there are ways
later for the happy hour.
but there are ways to game the system. What does occupation of spectrum mean? Do you have some occasional sparks emitted from the atmosphere? Well, yeah, that's you can have what the actual efficient utilization of the spectrum is not something you want the government to monitor, because it's not clear what it is, and then you're immediately into a different kind of a process. But just also in terms of this, set-asides and so forth, I mean, these now you're back into the rigidities of the system where you're sort of imposing particular solutions. And that's not what you want to do. You want to have an efficient, competitive process. You want to have a lot of innovation that comes through the competitive process. And if there are these, target areas that you want to hit, you say, well, that's, we need some extra help on that. I mean, the talk from the commissioner today was actually quite interesting in that respect when she argued for kids, getting access to, do their homework by getting online, and we have some deficiencies there. And she said, let's take this stuff out of inventory, sell it, and get the cash, and let's shop wisely. She mentioned library Wi-Fi. Actually, this is interesting because there are a lot of subsidies for broadband, right? We spend $4 billion a year to subsidize broadband into schools in the United States. We spent somewhere north of $75 billion total now, and there really is no good evidence that it's helping education. I have done a little bit of work on this. Difficult to see. The French are going the other way, by the way. They're banning electronic devices during school time. I don't know if you saw this. They took away all the cell phones. If you're over 15, apparently you can have a cell phone during school hours in France now. I'm not saying be more like the French. I didn't say that. I didn't say not to be more like the French. I have a French mother-in-law. I've got to be very careful on this one.
Bring us back.
More than normal.
She'll be playing this back for you.
So
Let me go back to you.
no, it's okay.
This
She
is going to be on
doesn't understand anything I
YouTube,
say.
so it's
Yeah,
okay.
no, I know. She never understands anything I say, so we're fine. But the point is, you do want to look at the efficiencies that can be supported with flexible rights, and then a process to get facilities, rights into the market that you can do all the competitive and innovative and discovery process you can do. And then if you have these targeted kinds of programs, they should be visible and transparent and cash for what you're buying. You don't want to backdoor it through spectrum allocation process where you bury. I mean, we've seen this in public safety. We've seen it in so many of the public allocations where it's just non-transparent. There are no incentives for efficiency, and it's a big problem to undo it. You're spending decades on it.
So you don't use spectrum policy to achieve some of those goals. Use more explicit mechanisms, what I hear you saying. And then the other thing that you mentioned earlier that I just want to go back to, so build-out requirements are a mistake?
I think they, in my book, I advocate, I want more competition for licensed and unlicensed and all flavors of licensed and unlicensed. And one of the ways to get that is to allow bidding for unlicensed, what would be, people think of it as a business model, unlicensed spectrum. It's not it shouldn't be that way. But if parties in the market want to say, here, we're not going to build a network. We're going to have some kind of coordination to use this for unlicensed spectrum, the way we think of that being used today. Why should they have to build a network for that? We want competition to decide that matter. So I think build-out requirements are very problematic.
Got it. What's the title of the book?
It's called The Political Spectrum, The Tumultuous Liberation of Wireless Technology from Herbert Hoover to the Smartphone, available on Amazon. Thank you very much.
I was trying to make sure. How we just get that out of the way? Okay, Julius.
There's so much to unpack.
There is a lot.
So one thought comes to mind immediately from what Michele read in the Act is that I think our obligation is to ensure that all people get service. And we've tried to approach this, and I say we through the years, all the folks working on it, on how do we make sure that the people in the rural areas, which for business reasons, you got to remember that business are out there to make money. If they're losing money, they don't stick around too long. So trying to figure out how we make sure that those folks get service, and folks who may not be as economically well off.
Which businesses are you talking about? The provider business, or are you talking about businesses that will use the service in the rural areas?
I think it's a little bit of both. It's, people have to build networks. It costs a lot of money.
It does.
And they need to know that they're going to. So sometimes there's little things we can do, like allowing for higher power in the rural areas to reduce the cost of the infrastructure. But I think we've come at this in different ways, trying to achieve that. But it's a goal that I think we have an obligation to meet.
Do you have a reaction to Tom's portion of it, to not use spectrum policy per se to achieve that? So you said one example, which is the technical rules, but there's other examples like M2C or others where you say, I want the spectrum for free and I'm going to build out in rural areas, or I'm going to give it away for free to service. Does that make you more or less uncomfortable?
Uncomfortable. I think, first of all, come back to what Michele said about in each one of these proceedings, it's a different set of factors that enter into it. And I think it's just, we always go into these, what do we think collectively is the best way to achieve these things? I don't think it's a great result if what's been happening is we have service for some and others aren't getting it. And there's some upsides to mandates and some downsides as well, because it usually works better when people have incentives and they think they're going to go out there and provide service and they'll make money out of it. That usually is a better driver. I did want to say, from the engineering standpoint, great believer in flexibility. And I think one of the best things that the agency ever did was when we, after we had the AMPS standard in the first generation and the mandate of it, we actually had the proceeding that said, okay, you don't have to do AMPS. You can do digital. And I would contrast this with where that went in the United States and the natural evolution from the one generation of the next, driven by the market, driven by the technology, driven by the folks who were deploying service. So those transitions all kind of happened without the FCC saying, okay, here's the next thing. Basically, we opened up additional spectrum bands, but we never said this is the 2G band, this is the 3G band, which kind of, at least in my judgment, got Europe into trouble because they auctioned bands for 2G service or 3G service, and as the technology evolved, the folks who had paid money for 2G spectrum said, well, what about us? How are we going to compete with the 3G folks? And you've artificially tied your hands. There was no technical reason. One last point on the, when do you wind up getting some constraints that don't give you the full flexibility that you're thinking? I don't know that this is exclusively true on the federal side, but because it happens as well as the non-federal side. The technical characteristics of systems and how things are going to be deployed matter relative to sharing. So you're faced with this tension between total flexibility and the true analysis on the technical side. So for example, when you look at what happened with AWS-3 and the freeing up of spectrum, the reason it worked is the carriers worked with DoD and said, here's the characteristics of our system. We could do all the analysis that said, here's how far apart things have to be. Here's how we might be able to share during a transition and so forth. And so, and I couldn't remember the part of the Spectrum Frontiers item that we might have asked about the specifics, but I'm guessing part of it was driven by, remember, some of those bands were shared with the federal side. And the way they think about things is, I got to know what's going to be in there. It makes a difference whether I've got to have you this far away or that far away. Because I think as an agency, we have gotten away from, generally, here's the technology, there's one other example, medical body area networks, sharing with telemetry. The reason we came to agreement, although that has not taken off, was because the telemetry folks said, okay, they're going to be in hospitals. They're going to be in these places. It's not going to be like Wi-Fi in every home and every street corner. And we can work something out to allow that sharing. So sometimes, you can't make it as flexible as you wish you could, but you have to do that to squeeze more juice out of the spectrum you have.
Right. So you touched on something. I'm going to turn to Michele on this one. Would this all be easier to get to successes and failures and better decision making than just to successes if all spectrum management was under one roof? NTI and the FCC all under one major rubric. David could be chairman, for example.
Yes. I would be nervous about putting it all under one roof because I think having that division has actually been helpful. I'm glad that the FCC is an independent agency, but I'm not sure that without a separate agency at NTIA sorting out the interests of the various government users, that piece would work as effectively just being done by the FCC. I think NTIA within the IRAC and its groups can do a good job of trying to align the interest users and define what they need and how they need it, and then bring that to the FCC. So I guess I'm not convinced that the current system isn't working. I think the bigger problem is the incentive system that each of these groups have. I think where the FCC sometimes runs into problems is how it can incentivize, say, marketplace players who bought spectrum and then for various reasons could be equipment problems, that chicken and egg problem or whatever it might be, to then build out if they can't build out. And they may have bought the spectrum before it was really ready. And that's a good thing. It's flexible use, but then how do you encourage build out and how do you get it back if they're really not using it efficiently or not really using it? So tools there, but also tools on the NTIA side that we haven't even thought about or developed yet. I think Congress will certainly have a role in that, but getting that incentive auction authority is a key step, and there may be more key steps and more tools to come, especially on the federal user side. We could use a lot more incentives there than what NTIA currently has to use, and I think that would be really helpful. That may be more of an answer than you wanted.
Tom, would there be more successes if NTI and FCC, if federal and non-federal spectrum management was combined under one policy rubric?
Well, I mean, there's obviously an issue of gridlock to some degree, but I think some diversity here is fine. I think, out of respect for Herbert Hoover, who had spectrum management in the Department of Commerce before there was an FCC, that some diversity here is proper. And in fact, I would love to see the Commerce be more of a Department of Commerce and push harder on behalf of business, most generally defined, getting access to more spectrum. And so I think that there actually is a fairly constructive division of labor on that. I want Commerce to lobby for spectrum being shifted to commercial civilian use. I don't think it gets better by leaving everything at the FCC. Obviously, the FCC has various issues as a very industry-specific agency. Lots of discussion and analysis over the years by scholars, lawyers, economists, and others that say industry-specific agencies are very normally hidebound, captured, various other terms. And Commerce has a fairly wide constituency, but it's business-oriented, and we'd like to see that part of the debate, and it is part of the debate. And I just, my only complaint about Commerce is not that it's independent from the FCC, but that it's not more independent from the FCC, and that it doesn't push harder, and not just against the FCC, but against the other agencies that need to cooperate.
Peter, turning to you for a second, what do you think are the largest barriers to policymakers generating more successes overall?
Partisan politics, would that be appropriate to say? Sure. I'm not sure.
You're among friends, it's all good.
That's all right. That's okay.
Did you say this is webcam?
It's a very large group of friends. Peter's very popular.
There, that's good. I just have it write an anonymous piece to the New York Times tomorrow.
Oh, there we go.
But
now we're getting rolling.
No, I think that the policy issues that we talked about separately, the FCC and the NTIA. Those policy decisions are important because they also speak not to the now, but they speak to the future of what your country is achieving. And that country meaning every aspect of the country, private business, government, military, academic legs of the stool. And there needs to be an overall guidance, I think, in terms of that. So I see that as a very important role that the government needs to play. Whether they're best played from the Commerce Department, which I think I've always had this interesting or this thought. Whether you're the FAA, the FCC, the Commerce Department, you walk a very fine line between supporting an industry that needs support to be competitive in a global basis, or regulating that industry. And those things are really on different, they're sort of on the opposite side of that. So I really do like to think about the policy stuff staying with the government and the government having a responsible thought about what they want to achieve, but from a higher level. When they try to get down to the real specifics, this little band for that little person, I think that's very hard to make good decisions doing that. But allowing having an overall view, it's like even running a company, right? An overall view where everyone understands what their role is, you can achieve that much more effectively.
One thing that has come up in other contexts by investment folks consistently come to is the role of uncertainty. Do you feel like in your experience in this business that on spectrum-based services that uncertainty has played a role, or is that a real fear that people should be worried about as driving failures or successes?
It's an interesting point you make there. Uncertainty is part and parcel of business just at any level. I think what you have to think about is what drives and what side of the risk you are taking. 25 years ago, when people were talking about a 10 megahertz spectrum, they were pretty convinced that they couldn't, that it could not really support a large enough business. You couldn't get the volume on it. But if you sat and you talked to, at that time, Lucent, I remember the names of the companies now, Lucent and Nokia and Ericsson, and you saw the amount of money that was going to solve this problem from the private sector, it gave you a high degree of confidence that that was where you were going to lay. It was a good bet to lay down. So to the extent that you understand that there's a lot of people coming at this thing from a lot of ways, that actually, and the more you understand the dynamic of what you're talking about, you know, what park you're playing in, I suppose, you have a much better ability to understand that, what the risk is and how to mitigate that risk, and really how big of a risk is it.
So we're going to open up the questions from the audience after one more for the group. Without naming any specific proceeding, to what degree do you think that failures are the result of good people with good information but just ending up making a bad choice, even though it was well-intentioned at the time, versus a political, to play off what Peter said, and a conversation I had with Dale yesterday, or a situation where the politics got in the way and drove a bad decision, either because of lobbying or political pressure from somebody external to the agencies? Michele, that's a tough question.
That is a tough question. I think it's more the former. I think and some decisions are just very difficult to make, because I think the biggest barrier we have is the fact when you look at the spectrum chart, it's all colored in. Incumbency is the biggest barrier that the policymakers have. And how they resolve that requires some very tough choices and trying to balance the various interests at stake. And a lot of the incumbents don't want potential interference, or they have other issues that they're going to raise. So I think it's hard to make good decisions in that context, and especially when there are a lot of different users. And ultra-wideband is one that may be cited down the road, and there are many others. But who your neighbor is going to be a critical factor in success. Or failure, more so than the policymakers, how they approach it. They have limited tools and ability to deal with that. So I think it's less the politics maybe and more the fact that you've got a very messy and increasingly encumbered environment.
Peter, Tom, Julie?
Well, it's the nature of the process where, I call it the political spectrum, because, in the situation, it's not just that the politics get to it late. The politics get to it instantly because you're in a structure where you as a decision maker wouldn't make any difference if it were me or, anybody else who has to make a decision. You're within narrow guidelines. You have a rulemaking structure that forces determinations that in many cases are not susceptible to adjustment by the market. And so I think it's the structural nature of the system that's been set up in the 1927 Radio Act to steer a lot of this. Now there has been progress and there has been a lot of liberalization, but it's the tumultuous liberation of wireless technology. It always takes a push, and we still have a resting point for the equilibrium that still gives us all these challenges. So I really take it as a process problem.
Do I get to go last? So, notwithstanding the title of the book, and I don't think of this as a political problem in terms of the way most people might think of this as red and blue. Right. And even in terms of the politics of who's stronger on each side. I think that the problems generally are really hard, and they're getting harder. We get into debates that I think, there's a little bit of the element of trust. Who do I listen to? Who do I believe? One side is telling me no problem at all, and the other side's telling me that this vital service is going to be wiped out. Who do I believe? I do think that clearly the commission has got a role, and in the end we have a responsibility. But to the extent that we can, we've had some success in getting the parties together. And sometimes when you get the engineers sitting down at the table, not every time, you can get to an answer that they both can live with.
The engineers always think the answer is to get the engineers together on those things.
They'll still give you the money.
Oh, okay. Students first. Questions? Yes, excellent. And we have a microphone on its way. Obviously, for everyone, identify yourself and your affiliation. So,
Sarah Rapisi, law student. So my question is a bit about risk mitigation. So without hindsight to guide you, how do you balance the risk of innovation yielding inefficient results or efficient results stifling innovation?
It's a great question, but I think that's where you need flexibility. It's kind of the other side of the coin of uncertainty is flexibility, the positive side, and that way you can fix the mistakes if they happen, and if they don't happen, that's great. But mistakes are inevitable, and Commissioner Rosenworcel said that in her remarks. You need to have the tools is to be able to fix those and learn from them and come up with more tools. And she's been a great advocate for trying to have more cutting edge tools and experiment with them. So I think that's how you rectify the problem is if there's a problem, then you find a way to fix it, or whatever piece of the problem needs to be fixed. It may not be the whole thing is bad, but there's one narrow area, and that's called petitions for reconsideration. and that's why these proceedings can drag out to try to get it just right, to get the whole process to go better.
You want there to be competition in the marketplace, not just in wireless services, obviously for everything, for innovation everywhere. And am I afraid that the innovations might not all work out? No, I'm not. Now, that's not the same position as all innovation is good. Of course, hearings this week in Washington indicate that people are afraid about some of the things that are happening. And look, you don't get to a better place by saying we're not going to have the innovation, or that we're going to have a governor on it, so that some council is going to decide which are the best innovations. I want that to be a competitive market determination by consumers, technologists, and capital markets. I mean, that system tends to work the best overall. That's what's going to maximize welfare. That's my observation. And certainly when problems arise, people should be aware of them. We should, in some cases, come up with new rules to try to address those, which we do. But stopping the innovation, no, that's not the way to get there.
I'd add one thing as well. You said without the benefit of hindsight. But in business, I'm in venture capital, so you see lots of new things, new ideas. But you always look to see who had a similar business model, who had something addressing the similar market, how did they do it, what mistakes did they make. So you always, if you look, you have benefit from hindsight in almost everything that you do. You just have to make that part of your initial scan of the marketplace.
Yeah, just so on the innovation side and the flexibility, it's always reminding yourself that you don't know what flowers are going to bloom from the seeds that get planted. Whether it's, all the innovations that have happened on unlicensed, whether it's RFID, who thought you were going to be opening your car door with some unlicensed device, and on the licensed side, the wealth of products. I think we all think of the smartphones, but there's so many other things that the industry does on connectivity. And remind ourselves also that there's hardly any problem we can't fix in the spectrum, and we have. I think if you look back, there were things, we had a service called TV Answer in the 218. It was going to be this great idea in the 80s of having something that would talk back to your television so you could order a pizza. Can you imagine that? Didn't go anywhere. We had, in the mid-90s, if anybody remembers the Apple Newton, and we had this spectrum in the middle, unlicensed PCS. Yeah, and it was like, so we started out at 40, we cut it to 20, and wow, we need connectivity for mobile things. Well, it didn't go anywhere, and we had these very complicated rules, which I would argue actually came from industry, spectrum etiquette, and said, so we can all pack more into this. The FCC needs to adopt these rules. Well, other than some office systems, it didn't go anywhere. What did we do? We went back, changed the rules. We reduced the amount of spectrum. We cut it back. 5 is still actually sitting there, potentially to be auctioned. And for the remainder, it's the decked phones that you buy in the stores.
That's what's left. Yeah, Apple blames you for that, by the way, because they asked for 75 megahertz of unlicensed for the Newton.
But
and the Newton's gone, but they're still mad at you.
That's okay. That's all right. They're not alone.
Trying to get some more questions in. Mr. Hatfield, I presume.
I make a lot of comments. I won't make mine. I think we're being a little bit unfair to the commission. Could you switch to the mic, please? Just, we haven't mentioned the experimental program. I think that's one of the strongest things at the commission. We tend to think a spectrum is all sort of being owned by somebody, but you can go to the commission under pretty straightforward rules and experiment. Moreover, you can even experiment, make an economic experience to see if people will actually, the dog will actually eat the dog food or whatever they say. And also, Julie, I think the STAs are used as another way of giving somebody who has an existing assignment a chance to change their rules and operate without a new technology. So I think we were just a little bit more negative than perhaps the actual evidence shows.
More questions, especially students, if we got them. But if not, we'll come down here. I think you're up next. Bennett?
Yeah, Richard Bennett. Julie, you got really close to the thing that I think is maybe key here, but maybe it wasn't clear to the non-technical people in the audience that one of the things probably the most important thing you're looking for when you make a spectrum allocation is it's a success if that allocation led to an improvement in the state of the art of wireless technology. So it's easy to focus on the applications, but whenever somebody makes a fundamental advance in wireless technology, that ripples through the entire ecosystem and improves the lives of every user of every application. So, I mean, isn't that the key metric of success?
So it is a benefit. I don't know that it's the only element. There's lots. But just to jump on the example that Richard, so we talked about the spread spectrum rules. And I mentioned before, not a lot happened. Well, CDMA was deployed in some of those devices before it went into the commercial wireless networks. And if you look at some of the technologies that have evolved and worked their way, I do think it's a key benefit. Maybe not the only one, but when you, I think I mentioned amps. When I started early in my career, the idea was we had to pick the technology. And what that meant is every improvement had to go back through a rulemaking. The models I think that we generally try to apply now is we're not going to pick the technology and hope that it's going to evolve. That we're not stuck with the technology that we talked about before that is 20 years old before it got deployed.
One more question.
Let me just say that the language that Michele read from the 34 Communications Act, that was taken seriously. It was the Federal Communications Commission responsibility to determine what the interference parameters were. And the evolving world that's come by backing away from that, backing away from the explicit 1927 Radio Act and the 34 Communications Act really has made all the difference. The smartphone world is literally impossible to imagine with all the interference sources if you don't download that to the market and allow carriers and application providers and technology suppliers to actually figure out what the interference is between your Angry Birds download and my Pandora. So, I mean, that has to be in the market, and that liberalization has meant all the difference.
Thank you. Scott Fox. I have 40 years of wireless experience internationally, domestically, and a few years in the federal government. I just wanted to see if someone could give us a conclusion from this panel. I think the objective was to reflect on the past and identify those key criteria for success that will apply as we look to the future. I heard a diversity of answers, and they all made sense. So is the answer, it depends?
Yes?
Yeah.
Say one word, amazing. Awesome.
All right, so do we have a takeaway on this? This is an interesting question. Anybody want to jump in on that? Is it depends? Sounds like it depends. I have one closing question I'm going to ask you all. Do you think there are more failures based on a failure to make a decision at all or making a bad decision?
Whoa. So the way I think of it is not bad decision in terms of things that I talked about before,
No, I understand.
technically.
Fair enough.
Yeah, but time is tough because I think one of the, our process is inherently slow. Sometimes if you're an incumbent, you feel that's good because you want to be sure. And we get into things like testing and so forth. But if you're an investor and you've got an idea that is going to get out there and you're waiting for the FCC, your capital could dry up. So I think we usually get there, not every time, but sometimes it's such a long period that by the time it's done, it doesn't matter anymore.
I'm tempted to say I'll get back to you on that. I have to have a rulemaking. I am tempted to say yes. The delays inherent in the system. You need on so many grounds. You do need to make decisions, get them out, and then if they don't work, then to redo it again.
80 TV channels wasn't such a bad idea until it was. Right. I mean, at the time, you could argue that was a fine decision. It was the failure to move quickly enough to
Well, you want to do things quickly and, again, have flexibility within the process so that you don't have to come back and do it all over again. I mean, I do have a chapter in the book, The 30 Years' War. I mean, cellular was on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post in 1945. That was one thing I was actually amazed to find out. It was even before the 1948 date that everybody gives it. But the FCC chair in 45 is saying we'll have those licenses out in just a few years. It's pro forma, and it was a 30 years war. But the delay, I'll go with that.
As an investor, I would say you can learn something from a bad decision. You don't learn much from no decision.
I would agree. Yeah, delay is the bigger risk.
Excellent. With that, I'd like to thank our panelists for a great round. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Bryan and the panel.